Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting and increasingly relevant topic, plant-based diets for kids. You've probably noticed more and more conversations around this, fueled by people thinking about both their health and, well, the environment. That 2019 Eat Lancet Commission report really highlighted the global shift towards more plant-focused eating.
Yeah, that report definitely sparked a lot of discussion. And for this deep dive, we're zooming in on something crucial for parents: how these diets actually affect children's growth.
Right.
You showed a collection of the latest research on this, and our goal today is to extract the key insights for you, those aha moments that give you a solid understanding without getting lost in the details.
Exactly. We know you're busy, so we want to get straight to the important stuff. Okay, so let's unpack this. What exactly does plant-based diet even mean? It turns out it's not quite as simple as it sounds.
You're right to start there. The term plant-based diet is actually an umbrella term. It covers a wide range of eating styles. It's really a spectrum, from people who mostly eat plants but might occasionally have a little meat or fish, all the way to those who completely avoid all animal products.
Yeah.
One of your sources has a table 1, I think, that breaks this down nicely.
Right, I saw that. So you've got fruitarians focusing on fruits, nuts, seeds, pescatarians who include fish but no other meat, and they usually eat dairy and eggs too. Then there's the plant-based or flexitarian approach,
Yeah.
where plants are the main deal but maybe not the only thing.
Exactly. And then we have raw food diets, where foods aren't heated above a certain temperature, and of course vegan diets cutting out all animal products completely. And let's not forget lacto-ovo vegetarians. They skip meat and fish but eat dairy and eggs, and lacto-vegetarians who eat dairy but not eggs. It's quite a diverse landscape.
It really is. And I guess that makes studying it a bit complicated, right?
Absolutely. That variety is really important when we look at the research. A study focusing on kids following a strict vegan diet might show different things compared to one looking at vegetarian children who eat dairy and eggs.
Okay.
So we need to keep those distinctions in mind as we explore the data.
Okay, so with that context, one of the first big questions that pops up for anyone thinking about plant-based diets for the children is about the main building blocks, the macronutrients. So energy, protein, fat. Are these diets providing enough fuel for growing kids?
That's a really valid concern, and it's something researchers have definitely looked into. When it comes to total energy or calories, most studies, and here we're talking about several of the sources you shared, actually show that kids on plant-based diets tend to eat a similar number of calories as kids on omnivorous diets.
Oh, that's interesting. I might have thought they'd be eating less overall. So kids seem to be getting enough energy generally. What about protein, though? That's another big worry for parents.
Yeah, protein is a bit more complex. Studies have noted that plant-based diets often have a lower percentage of their total calories coming from protein compared to diets that include meat. However, the good news is that overall these diets generally still meet the recommended daily protein needs for children. So it's not necessarily about a deficiency in the total amount.
Okay, that's reassuring. But I've heard talk about plant-based proteins maybe not being as good quality as animal proteins. What does that actually mean for kids?
You've hit on a really important point there. When we talk about protein quality, we're often looking at things called PDCAS and DIAS scores.
Ah, yes.
Think of these as scores that tell us how easily our bodies can digest and use the protein in food. Animal proteins, like those in milk, eggs, meat, usually score very high. They provide all the essential building blocks, the amino acids, in the right amounts and are easily used by our bodies.
And plant-based proteins tend to have lower scores? Is that the idea?
Generally, yes. For example, legumes, like beans and lentils, can be a bit lower in certain amino acids, specifically methionine and cysteine. Grains might be lower in another one called lysine. One study you shared even found slightly lower levels of some of these essential amino acids in the blood of vegetarian children compared to kids who ate meat.
So how can kids eating mostly or only plants make sure they're getting all those essential protein building blocks they need for, healthy growth?
Well, there are a few smart strategies.
Okay.
One is simply to eat a wider variety and potentially slightly larger amounts of plant-based protein sources throughout the day.
Okay.
Another really effective approach is what we call nutrient combination. Certain plant-based proteins complement each other.
Like pairing them up.
Exactly. What one might be a little low in, the other has plenty of. Table 2 in your sources gives some great examples, like combining soya with wheat or peas with wheat or even potato with corn.
Ah, interesting combos.
Yeah. And then we also have plant-based protein isolates and concentrates. made from things like soya, pea, potato, which can be added to foods to give a protein boost.
That makes sense. So it's about being a bit more thoughtful about food choices rather than just relying on one or two plant-based staples.
Okay, what about fat? That's another macronutrient that's crucial for children's development, especially brain development.
Right. Fat intake in children on plant-based diets has also been studied quite a bit. The Vesci study, for example, actually found that vegan children tended to have the lowest amount of fat in their diet compared to vegetarian and omnivorous kids.
Okay.
However, and this is interesting, this same group also had a better quality of fat intake, so more of the beneficial polyunsaturated fats and less of the saturated fats.
Huh. That's an interesting trade-off. Less overall fat, but maybe a healthier type of fat. What about the total contribution of fat to their diets? Is it still within healthy ranges? Yeah, most studies show that fat still contributes a healthy 30 to 40% of their total calorie intake, even in plant-based diets. There was one study where vegetarian children didn't quite meet the total fat recommendations, but mostly it seems okay.
Got it.
One particular area of concern around fat in plant-based diets is getting enough of the N3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically DHA and EPA. As you mentioned, they're really important for brain and eye development.
Right. I know those are often found in fatty fish. So
Yeah.
how do kids on plant-based diets get enough? That seems like a challenge.
It is the challenge.
Oh.
While studies show that vegan children often have a higher intake of ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, which is a type of omega-3 fat, the body can convert into DHA and EPA. The conversion rate is generally quite low, usually less than 10%.
Wow, less than 10%.
Yeah. Because of this, it's really important to make sure they're getting enough total fat in their diet and regularly eating good sources of ALA that are easily used by the body.
Right.
Things like linseed oil, rapeseed oil, even sea algae to help with that limited conversion. But yeah, more research is definitely needed in this specific area for children on these diets.
Okay, so we've covered the main macronutrients, energy, protein, fat. Now let's dig into the world of micronutrients. The vitamins and minerals. I know there's often a lot of concern about kids on plant-based diets getting enough of these little but mighty nutrients.
Absolutely. The World Health Organization actually talks about something called hidden hunger, which refers to deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals. This could be a significant issue even if someone seems to be eating enough calories, and it can definitely impact growth and development. Several key micronutrients are often highlighted as potential concerns in, well, poorly planned plant-based diets. Zinc, iron, vitamin A, calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin B12 are the main ones.
Okay, let's start with zinc. What's the main issue with getting enough zinc from a plant-based diet?
Zinc from plant sources isn't absorbed as well by the body compared to zinc from animal sources. This is mainly due to the presence of compounds called phytates in many plant-based foods, which can interfere with zinc absorption.
Okay, phytates.
Yeah. A systematic review from 2023 found that children eating meat generally had higher amounts of zinc in their diet compared to vegetarian and vegan children. Interestingly, though, a study in Poland actually found that all dietary groups had less than ideal zinc intake. So it's not just a plant-based issue sometimes.
Hmm.
However, another study that actually measured zinc levels in the blood found them to be normal and not significantly different between vegetarian and omnivorous children.
So it sounds like while the amount of zinc in the diet might be lower, it doesn't always mean kids are actually deficient. Is that fair?
That's a good way to put it. And there are things you can do to help the body absorb more zinc from plant-based foods, like soaking and sprouting grains, seeds, and legumes before cooking them. That's mentioned in Table 3.
Okay, good tip. What about iron? That's another one parents often worry about, especially with younger children.
Right. Well, the systematic review actually found that kids on plant-based diets often ate as much or even more iron than those eating meat, and their intake generally met the recommended amounts.
Oh, really?
More,
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah. However, similar to zinc, the type of iron matters. The iron found in plant-based foods, called non-heme iron, isn't absorbed as easily as the heme iron found in animal products.
Oh, okay.
So when researchers adjusted for this lower absorption, they found that iron intake from food alone was usually enough for vegetarian children, but less consistently so for vegan children.
Right.
The good news, though, is that when they looked at both iron from food and supplements, most studies showed that children across all dietary patterns were meeting their needs. This suggests that supplements might be particularly important for vegan children to consider.
And are there ways to help the body absorb more of that plant-based iron? Like with zinc?
Yes, absolutely. Eating plant-based, iron-rich foods, along with foods high in vitamin C, think citrus fruits or bell peppers, can really boost the absorption of non-ham iron. That's also in Table 3.
Good to know. Okay, moving on to vitamin A. What does the research tell us about that in the context of plant-based diets for children?
Generally, the amount of vitamin A, or rather its precursors like beta-carotene, in the diets of vegetarian and vegan children seems to be similar to or even higher than in those who eat meat.
Hmm.
The one exception noted was a study in India that found more vitamin A deficiency in vegetarian preschoolers. This really highlights how important it is to consider different geographical locations and typical diets within those regions.
Right, context matters. And how can you make sure kids are getting enough vitamin A from plant-based sources or using it well?
Cooking orange and yellow vegetables, which are rich in beta-carotene with a little bit of oil, can help the body absorb and use that beta-carotene more effectively. Table 3 again.
Okay. Calcium's so important for building strong bones and teeth. Are children on plant-based diets getting enough of it?
Overall, the amount of calcium children get from plant-based diets seems to be quite similar to that of children who eat meat, according to the review. However, the calcium in most plant-based foods, apart from things like kale and maybe fortified bread or millet, isn't absorbed as well as the calcium in milk.
Okay.
Interestingly, the systematic review also found that many children, regardless of their diet, actually don't get enough calcium overall.
Huh. So it's a wider issue.
It often is. There's some limited evidence suggesting that vegetarian children might have slightly lower rates of bone formation compared to bone breakdown, although their overall bone density doesn't seem to be affected based on current studies.
So it's not just about how much calcium they're eating, but also how well their bodies are actually using it, that bioavailability piece again.
Exactly. And there are things like cooking, sprouting, even fermenting plant-based calcium sources that might help improve how well they're absorbed. Also noted in Table 3.
Vitamin D is another key nutrient for bone health because it helps the body absorb calcium, right?
You're right. And the research shows that vitamin D intake is generally low across all dietary patterns in children.
Sure.
So this is often a nutrient that needs to be supplemented, whether a child eats a plant-based diet or not.
Okay.
Plant-based sources include things like mushrooms that have been exposed to UV light and fortified cereals, but supplementation is often recommended regardless.
Right. Finally, let's talk about vitamin B12. This one seems to be a particular concern for people avoiding animal products.
You're absolutely right. The systematic review showed a clear trend. The amount of vitamin B12 in the diet tends to be highest in children who eat meat, lower in vegetarians, and lowest in vegans, just from food sources.
Mm-hmm.
However, and this is really important, when you look at B12 intake from both food and supplements, this trend often reverses. Vegans sometimes have the highest overall intake because they are generally more likely to take supplements.
Ah, because they know they need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A study in Poland found similar rates of B12 deficiency in children who ate meat and vegetarians, but much higher rates in vegan children who weren't supplementing adequately. This really highlights that B12 supplementation is, well, essential for children who eat very little or no animal products. Fortified foods like some cereals and nutritional yeast can help, but often aren't enough on their own for those strictly avoiding animal products.
Okay, so it sounds like with careful planning and sometimes supplements, many of these micronutrient concerns can definitely be managed in plant-based diets. Now, let's get to the big question that I know is on everyone's mind. How do plant-based diets actually impact how children grow? Height, weight, that kind of thing.
Yeah, this is where a lot of research is focused. Traditionally, many guidelines and publications have pointed out potential risks to growth with plant-based diets. A recent systematic review you shared noted that vegan diets, though not always vegetarian diets, might be linked to slightly slower growth and a higher chance of being underweight or having stunted growth. However, it's also important to note that the percentage of children affected seems to be relatively small. And interestingly, this same review found that children on plant-based diets might actually have a lower risk of being overweight.
And it's crucial to remember, as that review pointed out, that these growth studies are generally observational, right? It's not really ethical to randomly assign children to different diets for long periods just to see what happens.
Exactly. That's a really important limitation. And the studies also look at a wide variety of plant-based diets and children of different ages, which can make it tricky to draw firm conclusions sometimes. However, Table 4 in that review does a good job of summarizing several key studies from the last few years.
Looking at that table, we see a real mix of findings, don't we? For example, a group of researchers in Poland, Ambroskiewicz and colleagues, they've done several studies and generally haven't found significant differences in weight, height, or BMI between vegetarian and omnivorous children.
That's right. And the large 2019 study by Vader and colleagues in Germany also found no significant differences in growth scores like Z-scores for height and weight between vegan, vegetarian, and omnivorous children after taking various factors into account.
Mm-hmm.
However, they did observe a small number of vegan children who were shorter for their age, and they also saw lower rates of overweight in the plant-based groups.
Then we have the 2021 study by Desmond and colleagues, also in Poland, which found that both vegetarian and vegan children were shorter than those eating meat, with the difference being more significant for the vegan children, and their BMI scores were also lower.
That's an important finding to consider, as it shows not all research points in the same direction. On the other hand, you have the 2021 Hovinen study in Finland. They looked at children in daycare who were eating nutritionist planned diets.
Oh, that's interesting. Planned diets?
Yeah. And they found no differences in growth scores between the different dietary groups. This really suggests that careful dietary planning could make a big difference.
Okay. We also see the studies from the Czech Republic by Svitnica and colleagues, which have shown somewhat mixed results. Some analyses found no significant differences, while others indicated lower BMI scores and a higher percentage of vegan children being underweight.
Right. And the 2022 Elliott study in Canada found no statistical difference in average growth measurements, but did report more underweight and less overweight in the plant-based groups. The most recent study in that table, by Ferrara and colleagues from Italy in 2024, looked at infants and found that babies born to vegan mothers had lower weight at birth and at 6 and 12 months, and were shorter at 12 months compared to babies of mothers who ate meat.
It definitely seems like the evidence is still a bit varied, especially when we look at vegan diets specifically and maybe growth in very young children.
That's a fair summary. However, it's worth mentioning a broader analysis, a meta-analysis, which found that after accounting for the different ages of children in various studies, there wasn't a major concern about stunted growth, specifically in vegan children and adolescents overall.
Okay.
And when we look beyond just height and weight, some studies have found that vegetarian and vegan children might have less body fat and potentially healthier markers for cardiovascular health later on. So it's not just about hitting certain growth curves, perhaps.
That's an important point. It's about overall health and well-being, not just one or two measurements. So, given all this information, what are the practical implications for doctors, dietitians? What advice should they be giving to families who are considering plant-based diets for their children?
This is a really crucial area. The review you shared highlights a significant gap in our knowledge. We don't have much data on how children grow and how well they get their nutrients in studies where their parents are actually receiving professional dietary advice.
Ah, right. That seems key.
It really does. It's a key piece of the puzzle that's missing. However, based on what we do know, it seems that while plant-based diets generally meet their needs for energy and the main building blocks, there are definitely things to pay attention to, especially getting enough vitamin B12 and ensuring good quality and absorption of protein and other micronutrients.
Mm-hmm.
And it is encouraging to see that when supplements are considered, vegans often have good B12 intake, as we discussed.
What about the official recommendations from major health organizations? What do they generally say about plant-based diets for kids? Are they supportive, cautious?
The review looked at the position statements of various healthcare societies over the last 10 years. Table 5 gives a good summary. Most of these organizations, including groups like Dietitians Canada, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in North America, the Canadian Pediatric Society, they generally support well-planned plant-based diets for children.
Okay.
But with the strong caveat that families should get guidance from a healthcare professional who understands the specific nutritional needs of children on these diets.
So the guidance part is key.
Absolutely. However, the level of support does vary. For example, the guidelines in France tend to be less enthusiastic, more cautious about vegan diets specifically for infants, children, and teenagers. They cite concerns about the potential for nutrient deficiencies, even with supplementation.
Okay, so some variation there. It sounds like the general consensus is leaning towards cautious support, but with that strong recommendation for professional guidance, what kind of monitoring or assessments should be in place for children following plant-based diets?
Yet, given the potential for some nutritional challenges, regular growth monitoring is definitely a good idea. For children under 2 years old, it's wise to check their weight, length, and head circumference more frequently, perhaps monthly in the first 6 months. then every 2 to 3 months after that.
Okay.
For older children, at least an annual checkup that includes growth measurements is a good practice.
And what about their actual food intake? Should that be assessed regularly by someone?
Ideally, yes. It's recommended that children on plant-based diets have their diets assessed by qualified professionals like registered dietitians or nutritionists at key stages in their development,
Such as,
such as when they start eating solid foods, when they begin nursery or school, and during adolescence. These assessments can involve looking at food diaries, maybe doing clinical evaluations, and potentially checking nutritional blood levels if there are specific concerns.
it sounds like healthcare professionals themselves need to be, well, better informed and prepared to support families who choose these diets.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Healthcare professionals are really encouraged to seek out more education on plant-based nutrition and to be aware of the guidelines in their own country. Understanding the different cultural and personal reasons why families choose these diets can also help them provide better, more sensitive care and advice.
Mm.
It is a bit concerning that some parents have reported feeling skepticism or, frankly, a lack of knowledge from their healthcare providers. This has even led some to not fully disclose their child's diet.
Oh, wow. That's not good.
No, it really isn't. It highlights the need for better education and awareness within the healthcare community itself.
So to bring it all together then, what would you say is the most important takeaway for someone who's been listening to this deep dive?
I think the key message is that most children can thrive and grow well on well-planned plant-based diets.
Right.
However, and it's a big here, however, it requires a good understanding of their nutritional needs and careful attention to making sure they're getting enough of all the essential nutrients, especially micronutrients like vitamin B12.
Right.
Seeking guidance from healthcare professionals who are knowledgeable about plant-based nutrition is highly recommended for families choosing this path. It really helps minimize any potential risks of poor growth or nutrient deficiencies.
And it sounds like the research in this area is constantly evolving, so it's important for healthcare professionals and interested parents to stay up to date.
Exactly. The world of plant-based foods is always changing, new products are coming out, and our understanding of how they affect children's health is also growing all the time. By staying informed about the latest evidence and best practice guidelines, healthcare professionals can offer the best possible support and advice to families, ultimately helping children on plant-based diets achieve their full potential for growth and development.
That's a fantastic overview, and it leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Given the growing interest in plant-based diets and all these nuances around children's growth and nutrition that we've discussed, what role do you think personalized dietary advice and ongoing research should play in making sure future generations are as healthy as possible? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.